itself. The danger, if I'm being less optimistic, more pessimistic, is that the whole process crashes before that can emerge, because time is running out and the clock is ticking, you know, all of these cliches, and if the UK government continues to be unable to get its act together and put forward something that makes sense and is capable of being negotiated, then I guess there is a real risk, probably a greater risk today than there was 3, 6, 9 months ago, of the whole process falling apart. So I guess, you know, that's not really helping you very much. I'm optimistic there could be a softer Brexit, but equally I think there's a real risk of a no-deal Brexit, and that would be pretty catastrophic in my view.
So by whole process falling apart, you mean the no deal, or you mean also the government falling apart? Or
probably both, I think, in those circumstances. But you know, if you look just now at the Irish issue, for example, it's hard to see how that is resolved properly without the UK remaining in the customs union. Now, you can look at that optimistically and have that as part of the evidence for saying, well, common sense, the majority has to assert itself at some point. But equally, time is running out for that to happen. The EU is going to insist, I guess, and as far as I am aware, is going to insist on, you know, if not absolute resolution in every detail by the Council meeting in June, then some significant process, because the Irish issue has got to be dealt with in the withdrawal agreement, not just in the statement about the future relationship. So, yeah, we are, again, to come back to what I think is going to happen, I think we are at a moment where, you know, we could see the momentum towards a softer Brexit, but equally we could see that no-deal Brexit. And you know, that doesn't help, I think, anybody right now who's trying to glean any kind of certainty for their own life, if you're an EU national living here, or for a business who's trying to work its way through the different permutations that might apply in the months to come.
So you've raised a lot of issues, some of which I want to come back to, such as the possibility of a second referendum, but perhaps we can try to unpack them. The withdrawal agreement. So the government's been rejected 14 times in the House of Lords, and soon it will go to the Commons. How will the SNP vote in a Commons?
On the withdrawal bill overall, we'll vote against it. Scotland voted to remain in the EU. It would, I think, be inconceivable if the SNP in the House of Commons was to vote to leave the EU. We've got, I don't want to immediately delve into the technicalities of the implications of the withdrawal bill for the devolution settlement. That's a whole host of other issues that are very real, although they can sound, and frequently do sound, rather technical and abstract. And there'll be a vote tomorrow in the Scottish Parliament about whether the Scottish Parliament will give legislative consent to the withdrawal bill as far as it impacts in Scotland. And I don't think I'm giving any of the journalists here any exclusives when I say I would be astonished if the Scottish Parliament voted tomorrow to give legislative consent to the withdrawal bill.
And so, but could there be any circumstances in which the SNP could support the government? Some sort of guarantee of what Scotland have said, what you have said, you know, very clearly you would want in either a Norway-style, you know, some sort of a Norway-style deal, or a guarantee on the powers that Scotland would get back from Brussels. Is there something that is up for negotiation?
In terms of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament's position on the withdrawal bill, I mean, you know, the withdrawal bill is, we've always accepted that if the UK, because it's pretty obvious, if the UK is leaving the EU, however much we might regret that decision, arrangements have got to be made for the withdrawal process. So we've said if we can resolve this dispute between the Scottish Government and the UK Government around, I mean, it's basically in areas of responsibility of the Scottish Parliament that are currently governed by EU powers. Post-Brexit, those responsibilities should lie with the Scottish Parliament. We would agree in a number of areas to operate these powers on a UK-wide basis, but with our consent and agreement. The UK government wants to centralise those powers for a period so that it can effectively dictate and impose what happens.
Is there a time period where you would accept it, or has it even said so?
One of the, I suppose, elements of progress that has been made in our discussions has been that this all started where it was open-ended in terms of time. there's now been suggestions made that would effectively sunset some of this, but it would still lead to a period of up to 7 years where the Scottish Parliament, without its consent, could have its powers in areas like agriculture, the environment, fishing, food standards, food labelling restricted. Now, to go back to your question, try not to lose sight of your original question, if we can reach an agreement, which we've been trying to do, that says, yeah, OK, on some of these things we would, and even if Scotland was independent, no doubt choose to cooperate across a UK-wide basis. If we can reach agreement that says, yes, we'd do that, but on the basis of consent and agreement, not imposition, then the Scottish Government would be prepared to reach an agreement of that nature, even although we continue to not support Brexit, but we would reach an agreement on the basis of the arrangements for withdrawal.
And at this stage today, how likely do you think that is?
I'm trying to cling on to some hope. The vote in the Scottish Parliament is tomorrow. Now, it doesn't mean we can't come back at a later stage potentially and overturn that vote. But we've been trying to reach agreement on this for months and months and months now, and we're really at the 11th hour. Well, more than the 11th hour. I think we're at 3 minutes to midnight at the moment, and it doesn't look particularly promising. But we'll continue to do what we can and see whether an agreement can emerge. Interestingly, tomorrow it is likely to be not just the SNP government that votes against legislative consent. We are likely to be joined by Labour, the Liberals and the Greens in the Scottish Parliament. So it will only be the Conservatives that vote to go ahead, notwithstanding this dispute. So the UK government have been trying over the past few weeks to suggest that the SNP is isolated and it's all because we are obsessed with Scottish independence. This actual issue has nothing to do with Scottish independence. But far from that being the case, we will stand with the other parties, and it's the Tories and the UK government that's starting to look a bit isolated on this issue.
Right. So, I mean, just from what you described, it seems, that you have quite a bit of leverage because, again, we've seen that in what you said in your introductory remarks, and then we've seen that the Tories are certainly not united in their position, and there are suggestions that in a Commons vote, one could draw many of them away. So what leverage, how much leverage do you think you have?
Well, I've just been talking about, I suppose, what is a bit of a subplot of the Brexit issue involving the powers of the Scottish Parliament. To move back into the main plot, I suppose, which is what happens and what decisions the House of Commons takes around the future relationship between the UK and the EU. The SNP is the third biggest party in the House of Commons. We've got a fair bit of clout and leverage there. My firm belief is that certainly on the customs union, possibly also on the single market, but certainly on the customs union, I think there is very close to and very possibly an actual majority in favour of continued customs union membership. And presumably the government thinks that as well, which is why it looks as if it's going to try to delay some of these votes in the House of Commons. Now, all of that depends on, Tory rebels, Remain-minded rebels, because there's different categories of Tory rebel on the Brexit issue. That depends on them being prepared to follow that through. It depends on Labour remaining almost completely united. These are obviously big imponderables at this stage. And the reason I wouldn't be quite so definite about the single market, unbelievably in my view, is because Labour doesn't appear to be prepared to take a united position on single market membership, which I find really quite difficult to fathom, given that I'm pretty certain that the vast majority of Labour MPs, the vast majority of Labour members across the UK would pretty strongly favour continued single market membership, and it seems that Jeremy Corbyn and his leadership of the Labour Party is out of step with that. And we may see that change, of course, over the next few weeks.
So and to press you a little bit more on this issue, I mean, of the various options on the table now, obviously customs union, with no single market, then customs union partnership, which is now what Theresa May is trying to get her cabinet to sort of discuss the maximum facilitation arrangement. Which scenario do you think that Scotland can seriously influence, and how? In other words, can you sort of show us what you think the next few months could look like if you at the SNP had a way to influence it?
I do think there is a real possibility, and the SNP can be part of this in the House of Commons. I think there is a real possibility of forcing the UK government out. Whether the government would survive this is another question, which we can park there for the moment, but forcing a position that is for remaining within effectively the current customs union. And you know, I do think that there is a realistic possibility of that. The other two options, the customs partnership and the max fax, which when I was growing up was a form of makeup, but it's now
Max Factor, we loved it.
Now one of the potential options for the future trading relationship of the country. Both of those options, particularly max fac, have been pretty much ruled out. Neither of them easily or at all resolve entirely the Northern Irish border issue. Incidentally, being in the customs union doesn't even completely resolve that either, which is why I think single market membership would also be important. But you know, it comes back to the absurdity of the position we find ourselves in. The UK cabinet is currently tearing itself apart over two possible options that the other side of the negotiation has said neither of these will work. And you know, it just sometimes feels as if they're operating in a bit of a parallel universe.
So in all of this, I mean, how are you advising? Obviously, in the audience, we have investors and you know, people who are going to be reading about this are people who are very interested in the economic future of Scotland. How are you advising companies and other economic actors to prepare for Brexit? And how are you trying to mitigate, you know, what possible consequences? And in particular, the status of Edinburgh as a major asset management hub. You know, there is some fear that, you know, it could move to Dublin as the main capital. So can you tell us what how you're acting on the ground as a result?
We're doing a number of things, I guess, both at the macro and the micro level, on the ground level. At the macro level, we are trying as hard as we can to influence the direction of travel towards a softer Brexit, where trade is not disrupted, where you know, customs arrangements don't become a barrier to trade. I mean, interestingly, I know we'll come on to talk about Scottish independence, but in the 2014 independence referendum, those of us advocating independence also advocated remaining in the European Union, remaining in the customs union and the single market, because we recognise the importance of that to trade. The UK market is important to Scotland, but so too is the 8 times bigger single market. So at a macro level, just as we've been talking about, we are trying to influence things in a positive direction. At a macro level, we are working very closely across a range of sectors, as we have been since the day after the referendum almost, to understand their particular concerns, particular needs, what they want to see out of Brexit, the steps that they need to take now to start to prepare for all options. And it's very difficult for business to prepare when they don't know what the arrangements are going to be. And we then are working with companies in different sectors to assist as much as we can with their own preparations, but also make sure, to the best of our ability, that what they say is important to them is being fed into the Whitehall machine as the UK government tries to put its own negotiating positions together. I mean, interestingly, one of the issues that's always been important, but has, you know, I guess for the last 6 or 9 months in Scotland, and I'm sure it's the case here and in other parts of England as well, the issue that has been coming progressively up the agenda for most companies I speak to in most sectors is access to skills and labour, and concerns about what could be restrictions on European migration. And that's a particular concern for Scotland, given that we've got a different demographic curve, and it's probably more important, undoubtedly more important to Scotland, even than it is for other parts of the UK to make sure that we see nothing that makes it more difficult for us to attract talent from elsewhere.
So let's move to Scottish independence then. You've said many times that Scotland can only realize its full potential with independence. And you've indicated that in autumn you might lay out perhaps what the sort of future vision will be. But at the moment it does seem that Scottish independence is off the table. Is that the case? And are you concerned to a certain extent if the SNP grassroots may become disillusioned with no prospect of independence down the line?
Not really. I don't think independence is off the table. I'm not sure independence will ever be off the table, well, until it's realised, of course, and then it'll be a reality. Half or thereabouts, I mean, the polls haven't changed that much since the 2014 referendum. You occasionally see independence a couple of points up on the 2014 result, occasionally a couple of points down. But broadly speaking, just short of half of the Scottish population support Scotland becoming independent. If you delve into that, there'll be different opinions as to whether we should do that now or in 5 years or 10 years' time. But with that body of opinion, an option and a constitutional option like independence is not going to be off the table. I think there is, understandably, and that this has, I think, been clear over the past few months, there is a sense that we need to get to a point, and hopefully we will get to a point where there is some greater clarity on the UK-EU relationship in order to inform any future decision that Scotland might take. But as I said earlier on, when we were fighting the referendum in 2014, actually, ironically, one of the arguments that was used against Scottish independence was that we would get thrown out of the European Union and we'd have to queue up and wait for years to get back in. Ironically, we now find ourselves, because we're not independent, being taken out against our will. So, in independence, I think the case for that, both democratically because of what we saw in the Brexit referendum, but actually economically and in terms of business and trading relationships, to be able to secure not just a UK market, but for Scotland to be able to secure the ability to trade in the bigger single market, actually strengthens the case for independence in the future. So I would confidently predict it's an issue we'll continue to debate and deliberate until such times as it's realised.
Do you think there'll be a Scottish independence referendum first or a second Brexit referendum first? I'm not convinced, because you haven't ruled it. You haven't ruled it out. Brexit.
Yeah, and I'm probably going to avoid answering that question definitively in that sort of very typical politician way. I'm not convinced that. I mean, I get asked quite a lot. I was asked it in the Scottish Parliament last week why I don't lead the charge for a second EU referendum, and I suppose my answer last week was twofold. And firstly, the SNP is not going to stand in the way of that if there is, a body of opinion and a majority in the House of Commons for a second EU referendum. But it wasn't Scotland that voted to leave, and one of the issue that's been thrown up in a democratic sense for Scotland is, we voted strongly to remain, and yet that vote hasn't counted for anything. So, for us to say, well, let's have another EU referendum, well, how do we know the same thing doesn't just happen all over again? And I guess, as somebody who supports Scottish independence, you may say I would say this, but the democratic argument for independence, I think, is actually strengthened considerably by the experience we had in the Brexit referendum. So there may be a second EU referendum. I think that's going to take, well, given that presumably the Tories won't decide to back one, again it comes back to, do we think the Labour opposition is going to suddenly throw its weight behind an EU referendum? They might, but there's no great sign of it at the moment. So,
if there were, what do you think the question should be?
I guess that would really, I think, depend on when that was and in what context. So if you had reached a stage where there effectively was an agreement, a deal between the UK and the EU, then I suppose it would be, I should say I'm not particularly arguing for this, But I suppose it would be conceivable and feasible for the question to be, do you support that deal or not? I suppose the question then has to be, if the answer is not, does that mean staying in the EU? But if there is a no-deal scenario, then there's no deal to put to people. So I guess in those circumstances, the question has to be leave or remain again. So I think it's very difficult to answer that question. I'm not trying particularly to dodge it. I think it's just quite difficult to answer that question in the abstract, because it really depends, or it would depend over the next few months on exactly what scenario emerges, whether it's a deal, good, bad, or indifferent, or no deal. And that, I guess, would frame the question that people would be getting asked.
And so back to Scottish independence then. So what do you expect to lay out in the fall, in the autumn? And when could there be a new Scottish independence referendum?
Well, what I've said is in the autumn. And why did I say the autumn? Because that's when supposedly we will have, I say supposedly because we've, you know, I think all of us, as I said earlier on, have thought we would be closer to this point now than we are. But supposedly in the autumn, there is clarity. We won't just have the withdrawal agreement, but we will have at least a fairly fleshed out outline of what the future relationship is going to be. So that would be the point to say, well, does Scotland have the information it needs to look at that and decide whether it wants to go with that or whether it would prefer independence. So, yeah, by definition, we haven't got to that stage yet, so there's not much more I can say about what I'm likely to say when we do. But
so you, in any case, feel that you should wait for clarity on where the UK is heading before saying this is our general timeline for a new referendum?
Well, the purpose of saying the autumn was that hopefully we will have some clarity around that in the autumn. Now, I'm being slightly... Well, let's wait and see. You know, we are told, and we are still told, that there... I mean, presumably there will be clarity to the extent of, is there going to be a deal or no deal? There is then the question of, if there is an outline deal, how much detail will be in that? But, you know, the Prime Minister, if she was sitting here, would still, I'm fairly sure, be pretty emphatic that by the autumn, people across the UK are going to have a fair idea of what the new relationship might be. Now, there may be a hint of scepticism in my voice about that, but I'll take it at a word.
And so clearly these are hypotheticals, but so the last hypothetical is, how would you resolve the Scottish border problem if Scotland were independent? What would you look to? Well, a customs partnership, a max back?
I hope that the UK will be in the customs union, or a relationship that's as close to the current customs union as possible. And I do think, as I said earlier on, I think there are grounds for optimism. The road might be rocky to get there, but I think there are grounds for optimism that that's where the UK will end up, and therefore, you know, in a sense, a future independent Scotland in the customs union with the rest of the UK, these issues don't arise. But, you know, one way or another, we've got a UK government that is telling people, you know, as recently as yesterday, we've got it in print from the Prime Minister, there will be no hard border between north and south of Ireland, or between, you know, the island of Ireland and mainland UK. Now, if they can deliver that for Ireland, there's absolutely no reason why there should then be, you know, customs barriers between Scotland and England. I hope that what happens is that the whole of the UK, in whatever constitutional permutation it ends up in, is in the customs union, because that's best, in my view, for the continuation of the trading relationships that matter so much to Scottish businesses and businesses elsewhere in the UK too.
Moving away from this now, a question on, you know, obviously everybody makes comparisons between Scotland and Catalonia. I don't know how you feel about that, the comparisons, but what do you think of the new leader? I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Quim Torra.
It's not an individual I know at all, so I can't really pass comment on the sort of personality or particular characteristics. I think what I think about the Catalonia situation generally, and I should say, yeah, of course, inevitably people draw comparisons, but Scotland is not Catalonia or vice versa. And one of the things, whichever side of the debate in 2014 people in Scotland were on, we had a consented democratic process, which I think was to the great credit of the UK government at the time, as well as the Scottish government. And I wish that, and I know it's a different constitutional setup in Spain, but I wish there was a consented democratic way there that people in Catalonia could decide one way or another what it wanted its future to be. It's not for me to say whether Catalonia should be independent or not, but I think Democrats, whether they support self-determination or independence, I think Democrats everywhere will have felt a degree of real discomfort at some of the developments we've seen in Catalonia over the past few months.
And in general, you have called yourself a nationalist in the past. How do you feel about that in the era of Trump and Brexit?
I've always felt a bit, I suppose, a bit of a discomfort about the term, not because of what I stand for. It often strikes me we have one word, nationalism, to describe a whole spectrum of things that go from
chauvinism.
Exactly, not just Trump, but some of the sort of horrible right-wing, xenophobic nationalisms that we see in other parts of the world, to, and I think even the SNP's sternest critics would accept that is a million miles and a whole world away from what we stand for. We are, civic, inclusive nationalists. We're the party probably in the UK that makes the strongest case for inward migration, for example. So I think the problem with the word nationalist and any discomfort I feel is not because of what I stand for. I'm proud of what I stand for, but because we use that one single word to describe things that have no relationship to each other at all.
Okay, I have one last question, but before I ask the last question and then I open it up to the audience, I just want to make sure that I clarify one thing on the issue, the subplot that you were talking about before, which is the insurance that Scotland gets when the powers return from Brussels to the UK, that Scotland gets its proper share. There is leverage there in what you, potentially in what you have. So how are you using that leverage? What leverage do you have over Prime Minister May with your legislative veto, essentially?
Well, there will be, immediately people in Scotland and in the UK government would bristle at the use of the word veto. What we have, and my apologies to people who have no interest in the Seoul Convention, but we have something, Michael, I know you are deeply interested in the Seoul Convention, but that doesn't make you representative of the wider public. So we have a convention that says that Westminster cannot legislate for matters that are the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament without our consent. So technically, going by the Seoul Convention, if tomorrow we do not give legislative consent to the withdrawal bill, then the bits of it that apply to Scotland should not. So the UK government should remove them, and we've passed our own continuity legislation for this purpose. Now, that's what should happen if that convention is honoured. But the clue is in the word convention. It's a convention. It's not the law of the land. They could ignore it and decide to legislate regardless. But if they do so, they go into uncharted constitutional territory because it's never been done before. And I really hope we don't get there, because I think that would set a very bad precedent and a very bad example.
My final question, actually, is about Turnberry Golf Resort.
It's a wonderful golf resort.
Yes, which I hear has just banned Iron Brew. Iron Brew, forgive me, isn't that terrible? I'm Italian, you have to forgive me for that, with an American accent. That is one of Scotland's best-loved drinks, I understand, and it has now been banned on Trump's golf resort. I mean, what does that say about Donald Trump's taste?
I'm probably going to get myself into terrible trouble here. I'm pretty sure Donald Trump is a lover of Iron Brew. He is very keen to proclaim his Scottish connections. His mother was born on the Scottish Islands, so I'm sure he likes Iron Brew. I'm not sure about the sort of the facts of this. I suspect it's one of these stories that there's less to it than meets the eye, but it makes for a great headline. Trump bans Iron Brew from Turnberry.
Indeed, apparently because it stains. So
I'm sure that's not true.
All right, let me open up to questions from the audience. Who would like to ask the First Minister a question? I'm going to go in order of who put their hands up, so please. 1, 2, and 3.
Hello, Josh Roberts from JCRA, which is a financial risk consultancy. What currency would an independent Scotland use? And if your answer is sterling or the euro, how would you stabilise your economy after having handed over your monetary policy to a foreign state?
Well, in the 2014 referendum, we argued, and this is very well known, that we would continue to use sterling, which sterling is a fully tradable currency Scotland could do. We proposed doing that as part of a formal monetary union. We, and when I say we, I mean the SNP, my party, as opposed to the Scottish Government, has at the moment, or has had a commission looking at whether we would continue with that policy or reach a different conclusion. That report of that commission is due to publish over the next few weeks, which I'm sure will be hotly debated when it does. My party has, does not propose or support using the euro, and therefore, the options that the Commission has been looking at is sterling within a currency union, sterling out with a formal currency union, or a process that would lead to a distinctive Scottish currency over time. And as I say, that report will be published sometime over the next few weeks. I couldn't do that talk. I mean, I know you would like me to, but I'm going to resist the temptation. I've not seen the final report, so we'll see when that's published, and it'll give you lots to talk about and write about when it comes.
Please. Oh, can we have a mic over?
Hello, Michael Settle from the Herald. You said that the Brexit process had advanced the democratic case for Scottish independence. And you also said that Theresa May and the government, through her Brexit bill, were demolishing devolution. And I just wondered, if that is the case, then does that strengthen the necessity for a second independence referendum in the next year or so?
It's a great try. I have to say, I commend you for the effort you're making there.
Be creative.
You've heard what I've said, which is what I've said for the last few months in terms of the timing of setting out our further thinking on a referendum, and I'm not going to enlighten you any further this evening. But in terms of strengthening the democratic case, it stands to reason that when one of the nations of the UK, or in fact 2 of the nations of the UK, vote to remain, but the majority across the UK votes to leave, and we face the prospect of being removed from the EU against our democratic will, then clearly that raises quite profound democratic questions, and people will answer them in different ways. You will recall during the 2014 referendum, great play was made on the family of nations and the equality of the family of nations, and the Brexit vote somewhat gave lie to that, in my view. So I do think democratically it strengthens the case for independence, but on the cheeky part of your question, you'll have to wait and see.
Can we have another mic over here? And then Catherine.
Hello, First Minister. Tuchel Clyden, Daily Record. Doesn't a hard Brexit strengthen the case for independence? Is that what you wish for at night?
I don't. Look, I could sit here and argue that all sorts of things strengthen the case for independence. I'm not going to pretend I'm not a politician. You know I'm a politician. That I've spent most of all of my adult life arguing the case for independence. I don't want a hard Brexit. I don't want it because I don't think it's in Scotland's interests, and I don't think it's in the interests of the rest of the UK. And actually, and it's a point in a case I've long argued, an independent Scotland doesn't stand to gain anything from the rest of the UK being weakened economically. The rest of the UK will continue to be an important trading partner for Scotland. So a hard Brexit, much as you might think otherwise, I don't spend all of my days kind of being Machiavellian about all of these different permutations. A hard Brexit would not be good for Scotland, and it would not be good for the UK, and therefore I don't support it, and I haven't supported it at any point from referendum day in 2016 to now, and I won't support it in the future.
Catherine Garrett-Cox.
Thank you, Alessandra. First Minister, I'd like to change the topic, if we could, to the Paris Agreement. I think last time we met was at the World Forum on Natural Capital in Edinburgh at the end of last year, where you spoke very eloquently about the role that Scotland can play. So given the Brexit focus and paralysis being created in the UK, to what extent can Scotland take a leadership position around the topic of Paris Agreement and climate change? Thank you.
Well, thanks for what is a really important question, Catherine. I mean, we are continuing to take the lead on climate change and being a champion for the Paris Agreement. We're not alone there, but I think Scotland over the past decade has been one of the leading countries in the world, both in terms of setting ambitious targets around climate change and meeting those targets. We will, again, over the next few weeks, publish new legislation to increase the ambition of the targets that we're working towards on climate change. So it's very much an area where I think all countries have an obligation to lead by example, and I believe Scotland does that. I also think we need to, and again, it's an area where I want to see Scotland take the lead and make this case. We often see climate change, as it is in many respects, as a big challenge. You know, profoundly impacts on the way we live our lives, the way we do business, and in almost every aspect of society. But it's also a massive opportunity. The countries that get ahead of the curve on this are the countries that stand to win most in terms of the investment and the jobs and the research around the transition to a low-carbon economy. So I think there's a lot, as well as doing the right thing for the planet, there's a lot of vested interest for countries really being in the vanguard of the campaign to tackle climate change, and I want Scotland to remain there. Final brief point, I sort of don't want to take us back to the Brexit subplot, but one of the areas of responsibility that, if Westminster gets its way, remains centralised for a period versus what the Scottish Government wants, which is these powers lying where they should with the Scottish Parliament, is around environmental regulation. And I don't want to see the Scottish Parliament being in a position of seeing environmental standards perhaps weakened. And I know the Prime Minister, if she was sitting here, would say that's not her intention, and I take her word on that. I wouldn't be too sure about Jacob Rees-Mogg or some of the others. So, you know, it's a very real example of why what sounds like an abstract debate actually really matters on some very important topics.
Oh, gosh, okay. First, yes, and then Simon. And then fourth row, and then over here.
Angus McSwan from Reuters. Minister, I wanted to follow up on the Catalan question and what lessons, if any, the SNP and the independence movement might have learnt from the events there in the past several months, particularly in terms of if Westminster denies a second independence referendum for Scotland, what would you do then for the unilateral referendum? And also the foreign reaction to the Catalan situation, which was, you know, extremely negative. And then following up on that, could you tell us anything about the way you thought the Carla Ponsati case might go?
Well, firstly, without sounding in any way complacent or arrogant about this, because it's not my intention, I actually think rather than Scotland or the SNP, as I guess your question was more specifically targeted to, learning lessons from the Spain-Catalonia situation, I actually think it's the reverse. I think Spain and the Catalonia situation could actually learn from how the independence issue has been dealt with in Scotland. As I said earlier on, you know, whatever anybody's view on the question of Scottish independence is or was, that process was consented, it was democratic, it was consensual. And we had two governments with diametrically opposed views on whether Scotland should be independent or not, nevertheless coming together to agree a democratic way of that issue being decided. So that actually, I think, should be the model of referendums on these kind of issues everywhere. And so I think the lesson perhaps goes from Scotland to the Spain-Catalonia situation rather than the reverse. That's the model I would always want to see followed for Scotland in the future. In terms of Clara Ponsati case, I should be slightly circumspect, if you don't mind, because it is live court, a live court case at the moment. So I obviously don't want to do or say anything that would be seen in any way to prejudice the issue that the court is going to have to determine. And one of the things I think we should be proud of in the UK, not just in Scotland, is we have an independent judiciary that is not able to be nobbled or interfered with by politicians. However much the Daily Mail might want that to change sometimes, but that's something we should be proud of. So, but if I can take a step back from the individual case, for the reasons I explained, to the general, not to put too fine a point on it, I think one of the things that should cause discomfort to Democrats everywhere is the sight of politicians, democratically elected politicians, democratically legitimate politicians, ending up facing prosecution and lengthy jail sentences over something that should be capable of being resolved democratically. And I do have a lot of concern at the decision of the Spanish authorities to go down that route rather than try to find a consensual dialogue-based way forward. And I hope that even at this stage, the better option can be found.
Yes, First Minister, Simon Nixon, Wall Street Journal. One of the strongest arguments against independence in 2014 was the sort of Project Fear arguments, the original Project Fear, suggesting that Scotland's fiscal position wasn't strong enough, or that the economy wasn't strong enough to withstand the break with the UK. Given that since then, because of Brexit, we've seen the UK economy as a whole falling from the fastest growing economy in the G7 to the slowest, the economic challenges are even greater. So I'd be interested to know what you've done since 2014 to improve the productivity and performance of the Scottish economy, what measures you've taken to ensure that if there is another Scottish independence referendum, those Project Fear questions will no longer apply in Scotland's economy. There will be full confidence that Scotland can stand on its own 2 feet as an independent economy.
Okay, in terms of the part of your question that relates to steps the Scottish Government has taken, notwithstanding the constitutional arguments to strengthen the Scottish economy, there's notwithstanding growth in the Scottish economy that's lower than we would like, as is the case across the UK and compounded slightly in Scotland by the oil and gas issues that have been faced over the last few years. We see a number of positive features of the Scottish economy: unemployment that's close to a historic low, employment that's close to a historic high, export growth that is very positive. The productivity gap that we have long had with the UK has largely closed over the past decade. The challenge now is for us to close that gap with comparable European countries. We are taking a number of steps, from investing heavily in infrastructure, both transport, digital infrastructure, increasing substantially the investments we're making in government support for business research and development. We've just increased that by 70%, recognising that innovation-led growth is going to be important, and business R&D is an area where we've not done as well as we should do. We are in the early stages of establishing a Scottish National Investment Bank to provide additional routes to finance for some particularly innovative companies in certain sectors, low carbon being a particular example of that. So we're taking a range of actions across the economy to strengthen and position Scotland well for some of the challenges and opportunities of the future. The SNP report I referred to earlier on in the context of currency will also cover some of the issues around growth and the benefits of independence for growth in the economy. I guess if there's another Scottish independence referendum, so that the journalists here don't read anything into my use of the word if, I'll change that to when there's another Scottish independence referendum, just to cover all my bases. I would love to think we wouldn't have Project Fear again. I suspect that may be a naive and forlorn hope. But the Project Fear arguments have always struck me as kind of self-defeating for those who make them. I don't think it's true to say that Scotland couldn't cope economically as an independent country. On the contrary, I think Scotland would do very well as an independent country. But if your argument is that, well, Scotland's economically incapable, we've got a massive fiscal deficit and therefore we can never be independent, all of that's happened not because Scotland's been independent. That has come about with Scotland being governed as part of the Westminster system. And therefore that seems to me to be an argument not for doing things the way we've always done them. It's actually an argument for change and for looking for different and better ways to drive growth in the economy. And I think that argument is reinforced by Brexit, because we know that the Brexit path is, whatever opportunities that people like Boris Johnson wants to tell us is there from Brexit, we know that all of the possible outcomes will have a negative impact on the UK economy, possibly for a long time to come. Again, that seems to me to enhance the case for Scotland doing something different rather than being weakened in the process of Brexit. So I thought in 2014 and continue to think that Project Fear has the seeds of its own destruction within it. And if your argument is that Scotland's not doing well economically as part of the status quo, then that's not an argument for staying the same, that's an argument for changing.
So we have 5 more minutes. We had 2, I can't get the other one. I can just have here and second row. And could I ask you to ask them together? And so First Minister can answer in one go.
Paris Kortsianis from the Scotsman. First Minister, today the head of MI5 directly referenced misinformation from Russian state media as a threat to national security. If that's the case, shouldn't Alex Salmond face consequences as a member of the SNP, and shouldn't his producer not sit on the party executive?
Please. She's coming on the other side.
Hi, Akash Pound from the Institute for Government in London. First Minister, I've been following with great interest the ongoing dispute you've talked quite a bit about between the Scottish and UK governments over the EU withdrawal bill. And I suppose I just wanted to ask you, what do you think happens next, basically, after tomorrow? Because it is quite a big and close to unprecedented moment. The Scottish Parliament will, unless something dramatic happens, very quickly withhold consent for the bill for the reasons you've laid out. And is there still, in your mind, a path to reaching a further compromise such that consent, you kind of implied this might be open, but consent might later be given, and what could that look like? Because, I mean, the way it looks from my perspective is the UK government has moved from where it started out on the bill, not only in terms of the sunset clause, but also in terms of narrowing down the set of powers to the 24, where they say Westminster needs to have the power to, if necessary, impose frameworks. And is there space there for us for compromise that might meet your concerns, I suppose?
Okay, thank you.
Alex Salmond produces an independent programme for Russia Today, which he has control over the content of. I said when he announced that he was going to produce that programme and it would be broadcast in Russia Today, that it was not my choice and would not have been my choice of broadcaster. That remains the case, but Alec is not an elected representative of the SNP, and he's put his views forward, and he's entitled to do so. There are serious issues around Russia. I'm not for a second saying this is what you were doing with your question, but I think it's important generally that we don't allow those big and genuine issues around the threat that Russia poses to be too easily reduced to sort of party political point scoring, as can sometimes be the case. I listened to what the head of MI5 had to say today. I'm in the privileged position of being briefed directly by him on a fairly regular basis. So these threats are real, and I think they've got to be dealt with seriously, as I'm sure is and will be the case. I'll try to answer the question as briefly but as frankly as possible, and start, I suppose, with the sort of summary answer, yes, I think there still potentially is a path to a deal. Tomorrow, what happens after tomorrow, the ball very much will be in the UK government's court. They have a decision to make as to whether they just decide they're going to ignore the views of the Scottish Parliament or whether they're going to listen to those views and try very hard to get a deal and to close the gap that remains between us. Much of the progress, and I would readily acknowledge there has been some progress in the negotiations, the sunset arrangements, and the narrowing of the 111 powers to 24. Much of that progress, though, is intended to be in an agreement, not in the law. So we're effectively being asked to take on trust quite a lot. And it strikes me that if the UK government decides after tomorrow to carry on regardless, they'll be kind of demonstrating that we're right not to take some of this on trust. The issue of consent is always what it's boiled down to. And you know, the progress they tried to make there through some further amendments almost compounded the sense of wrong in all of this. Again, without boring everybody with the detail, they've tried to write into the legislation that they will only act if the Scottish Parliament has made what they call a consent decision. But they then go on to define that as the Scottish Parliament saying yes, or the Scottish Parliament saying no, or the Scottish Parliament saying nothing at all. So effectively, you know, consent's defined as anything the Scottish Parliament says, and they can carry on. I don't think anybody taking a step back from this would reasonably say that's something that a self-respecting First Minister of the Scottish Parliament could agree to. We've put forward two possible solutions. One, take what was the Clause 11, it's now, I think, Clause 15 in the bill, take that out completely and let's have an agreement where we're both agreeing to trust each other, or put into that clause a straightforward consent provision, which currently exists for other regulation-making powers that change the responsibilities of the Scottish Parliament. So the solutions are there. They're not complicated. It just depends whether there's the political will on the part of the UK government to take any of them.
Thank you. I think we have to close here. And in closing, I want to bring us to the beginning when I had mentioned that in those days before, or right after the Brexit vote, rather, you were the most visible of British officials, you know, not just in this country, but also on the continent. And at the time, you had you traveled to Brussels and immediately in the aftermath had spoken to many EU officials. Are you still speaking to them to try to help them find clarity through all of this?
We're trying to. We do speak to people on the European side, as we do officials on the UK side. I've recognised since day one, however frustrating this can be at times, that at the moment this is a negotiation between the EU and the UK, and therefore we have to try to influence it in roundabout ways. But we work very hard to do that. I hope to be in Brussels again over the next few weeks. So we will do whatever we can to bring as much influence to bear as possible. And as you rightly said, both in Scotland and with the SNP presence in the House of Commons, we've got some leverage to bring to bear on that, and we will seek to use it as constructively as possible.
Do you see yourself as a mediator of sorts?
I'm not sure I would necessarily describe for others to say. I would like to think that the Scottish Government and the SNP, two things are not exactly the same, can help to be part of a consensus that gets to a sensible or a less damaging outcome. So it's not so much mediation as being part of trying to bring what I think is probably the majority across the UK into reality.
Well, good luck with it. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for being with us. It was super interesting. Lots of questions. We didn't even get to all of them. So everybody was just enthralled. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.